10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Geological Society's third virtual public lecture of the year. Due to the ongoing situation with COVID-19, we've converted our public lectures into live virtual lectures. Throughout this lecture, your microphone will remain muted and your video will be inactive. You'll only be able to hear and see the speakers. I'm Dr. Megan O'Donnell, and I'm the Policy and Outreach Officer at the Geological Society. This week, I have the joy of coordinating Earth Science Week, an annual celebration of the earth sciences, which this year is focused on earth materials and the ways in which we use them in our lives. We've got loads of fun and exciting virtual activities taking place this week, and I would encourage you all to check out our social media channels to find out more. On Wednesday and Thursday, we will be hosting a special virtual film screening of the groundbreaking documentary Picture a Scientist, which documents the cultural experiences of 3 female scientists from cramped labs all the way to spectacular field stations. The film invites us all to reflect on our own biases and consider how we might make science more open and equitable. We really hope that you'll think about joining us for this special event. You can get tickets on the Geological Society's Eventbrite. Throughout 2020, the Society has been marking the Year of Life through a series of conferences, lectures, educational events, and resources. Today's lecture will explore why, for many, talking about geoscience is so difficult, and why geology is an unfamiliar and sometimes intimidating subject. Dr. Hazel Gibson is the Communications Officer for the European Geosciences Union, or EGU. She has extensive experience in public perceptions of geoscience and science communication, including studying geothermal power, subsurface visualizations, and the influence of regional geological heritage. Combining experience in industry and science communication with an interdisciplinary research approach, Hazel has developed a whole new understanding of how expert and non-expert geoscientists conceptualize the geological subsurface, and how that understanding can be used to improve the effectiveness of our communications. There will be a 15-minute question and answer session at the end of Hazel's presentation, so please submit your questions using the Q&A box function. Unfortunately, we may not be able to answer all the questions, but we'll do our very best. And finally, this video will be live streamed and recorded on the Geological Society's YouTube channel and uploaded later today. Without further ado, over to Hazel to give our public lecture. Thanks, Hazel.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you to the Geological Society of London for hosting me this week. It's really exciting to be able to speak with you all. Sadly, we're not in London, but soon, I'm sure, soon. So yes, as Megan said, I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about talking about geoscience, which is something that many of us have had a lot of experience of doing, some of us less so, and a lot of people are actually quite worried sometimes about talking about geoscience, especially because so many aspects of geoscience in public discourse, shall we say, they can be quite controversial, they can be surrounded by conflict, and it can be quite difficult to engage in these areas without feeling really nervous about it. So what I wanted to talk with you about today is some of the things about the reasons why geoscience conversations can be difficult, but also some ways that we can kind of approach these problems and hopefully overcome them. So I've got a couple of things we're going to try out during this session, a couple of little interactive things using Mentimeter. I don't know if any of you have ever used that before, but we'll have a go and see if the surveys work. And then I'll be really looking forward to having a chat with some of you at the end via your questions through the question and answer box. One thing I will also say is that if you are using Zoom, you should have the option to turn on closed captioning. So there should be a little CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you choose, you should be able to turn on subtitles. They are auto-captioned, so they're not going to be perfect. There will be strange words in there, I'm sure. But we just like to try and add this extra level of accessibility for people. So if you want to, click on that closed caption button. So I want to start off with thinking about the way that we all those of us that have engaged in science communication, particularly around geoscience, the way that we may have experienced this in the past. And one of the things that I find is the most common first thing that people say to me whenever I start talking about any kind of geoscience to a non-geoscientist is that they say that they don't know anything about it. It's one of the most common responses I used to get with my research work is for people to start any conversation with, I don't know anything about it. There's this kind of basic level of unfamiliarity, which is something that we as geoscientists experience more than some other of the more popular sciences, some of the more well-known sciences like biology, chemistry, and physics, which even though people may not feel like they understand it, they will have some familiarity with it from studying it at school or through other aspects. Geoscience doesn't always get the benefit of that because our studies in school environments are often hidden within other subjects. And so as a subject ourselves, it can often feel very unfamiliar to people. This presents a barrier to communications because quite often then the first time that people will come across something like a geoscience is in a critical situation when something has happened to them, when they need information, and they then are forced to reach out into this unfamiliar area. And equally, geoscientists need to reach back to someone who's experiencing something unfamiliar, which can be often very negative. This also relates to the other way that people will sometimes interact with geoscience topics that they're unfamiliar with maybe, is through kind of public discourse around controversial topics. And many of us have seen these things happen over the last few years. It feels like they're happening more frequently, but actually people have always been concerned around aspects of geoscience work and geoscience research. It's just now maybe we're getting the chance to engage with these ideas a little bit more often. But because of that sense of unfamiliarity, it increases the perception of the risk often for people that don't necessarily know much about these topics before they start to engage with them. This is not to say the people that protest these ideas don't know about the topics. Absolutely they do. Sometimes they know a lot about these information. But by that point, their ideas around the concept, the facts are very colored by their personal emotions, their opinions, and sometimes a sense of anger or disempowerment can also influence the way that they communicate. So if you're a geoscientist who's trying to talk about the actual science of these problems, you can face another barrier, this time not of necessarily unfamiliarity, but one of anger, of concern, of fear. And this can be just as difficult, if sometimes not more difficult to overcome than the one of geoscience just not being something that people are very familiar with and having that lack of relationship to the subject. One of the other things that we come across is almost like on the complete other end of the spectrum here. And that is the perception that if you're not engaged in something critical, if an emergency hasn't happened, or you're not facing a controversial event, is the perception that geoscience is boring, which is, we all know this is not true, but it is a really commonly held idea that we kind of swing between these two different ideas of geoscience as being maybe dangerous or concerning, and it being, dull. And that's also like a massive oversimplification. We know this, but it is still the way that a lot of people think about the topic. In a study that I did a few years ago, I was asking people to make a first connection between the word geology and any other word that they could think of that sprang to their mind. So word association is a really great way of getting someone's first impression about a topic. And so it was really useful for me to kind of find out how people approached the idea of geology and geoscience, just with no other context, literally just off the top of their head. So I asked people to associate with the word geology, and unsurprisingly, the number one choice of answer that associated with geology was rocks. Not very surprising, I'm sure all of you would agree. But in a way, it tells us something really interesting, that this kind of just rocks, just basic idea of what is at the heart of our science, is the first thing that people think of, both geoscientists and non-geoscientists. But if you look at some of the other words that were selected, things like volcano, tectonics, earthquake, these are things that can be very popular with people because they're very interesting, but they can also be sources of concern and of risk. And then if you look at the other two really big, apart from Earth, which is pretty generic, but it's earth sciences, so hooray for us. The other two big words that get selected are mineral and fossil, which are quite, we would consider them to be quite neutral terms, I think, like terms that aren't really emotionally laden, unless, of course, you're in a very specific context. And I think the issue with this is this shows that we've got this huge spectrum between people that are concerned around aspects of our geoscience that are unfamiliar with it, that don't really know what we do, unless they have to, unless something critical happens, but also this idea that, you know, it's not always as interesting because, you know, we just don't really know what it is. It's just rocks. It's easy to gloss over. Now, combined with that, we've also got another barrier. So many barriers to communicating geoscience, but one that particularly has had a lot of attention over the last few years, which is the rise of misinformation. So obviously misinformation is not new. It's not a new problem. It's been around as long as people have been sharing information. But it seems to be more of a problem now with the speed with which we can share ideas and opinions. And it's led to this growing conversation around how we combat misinformation. And a lot of people are looking to the sources of misinformation. Why are certain outlets promoting and sharing these misinformation? But also it's leading to a rise in the education of citizens around how they can be more critical of information. So for example, I'm sure many of you saw the UN's initiative of Pause earlier this summer, which was an initiative targeting mostly coronavirus information, encouraging people to be much more critical of the information that they consume and that they share. And so this is like another additional barrier that geoscientists can face is if you're communicating with someone and they have been the recipient of misinformation and haven't necessarily been as critical of it as they could have been, how do you engage with those concepts? What I will say is that the study of engaging with misinformation is a huge topic all in of itself. And I would say that I would not have time today to go fully into it. There are a lot of resources that I can recommend for people to go and look at to kind of learn tactics for addressing misinformation. But it is certainly something to consider when you're thinking about how we as geoscientists communicate about our science. So one of the things I always think about when I'm thinking about communicating around these barriers, the barrier of unfamiliarity, the barrier of misinformation, the barriers of fear and risk aversion and disinterest, is that as scientists, our reaction to overcoming any kind of barrier and communicating our science is often to add more facts, right? We add more data. We have information, we can add more information. This will help people to understand what we're going on about, the perspective we're coming from, that the reason why our data is good. The way to convince people of this is to add more data. Unfortunately, this is actually not the case. It is not necessarily helpful to people who are afraid or uncertain or just confused or disinterested to add more facts to the equation, because actually one of the things that you have to think about is that people aren't always looking for facts first when they start a conversation with a geoscientist or when they look for information around a geoscience topic. They're not always looking for the facts first. They're not always looking for the facts by themselves. Often they have a lot of other questions that they want answered around this idea. So for example, they might be asking, why is this topic important? Why should I care about it? And then needing facts. They might be asking, can I trust you as the person who's communicating to me? They might be asking if you understand them, if you understand the question that they're asking, which isn't always straightforward, because the question that people will ask you sometimes when they're communicating about geoscience is not always necessarily the question that they actually say. Sometimes you have to go a bit deeper into it to find out what they're talking about, because the issues that are connected to these problems are ones that are filtered through the person's own experiences. So no matter what you are saying to them, they are always interpreting these ideas through their own experience. And this is important for us because we have to remember that as geoscientists, we're doing the same thing. So now we're going to have our first little test. Let's see how it goes. So we've got, hang on. So I've got a Menti link. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, if you can use either the URL link there, or if you can use the code on www.menti.com. And what we're going to do is I'm going to link through to a survey that basically asks the question of, should geoscientists be sharing their personal opinions about geoscience topics when they communicate? So if you head over to that website now, I'm just going to add the page link, which has just deleted itself, which is super helpful. There we go. So, sorry everyone, typical technological issues. But keep voting and we'll see, should geoscientists share their personal opinions? Right, let's see if we can get this to load. Come on. There we go. Right, sorry, the code is 2230126. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click over now. So should geoscientists share their personal opinions about geoscience topics? Well, I am quite heartened to see that quite a significant proportion of you do think the answer to that question is yes. I added the two it's complicated settings because obviously it is complicated. And sometimes it's not as easy as just saying this is my opinion about something. But one of the things that we often find when we're communicating about controversial ideas and we're trying to connect with audiences is that, yes, geoscientists should be sharing their opinions about geoscience topics, even if it's something that they're talking about. And this can be really, really uncomfortable for geoscientists to do because, as with a lot of the other science disciplines, one of the main things that we are often taught is that science is objective. That it should be about the data, that we use the scientific method to come up with reliable information that should be trusted by itself. But obviously the reality is that science is not objective. Even science subjects that feel very disconnected from the human experience, like things like, the study of deep mantle minerals, the question around what color the mantle itself is. This feels very separated from the human experience that many people would think of with geoscience. But even these aspects of geoscience are filtered through the personal experiences of the people doing the study, and also the people that did the studies before that led up to this. This means that the way that we access concepts, geological concepts, is influenced not just by our training and experiences scientifically, but through our own personal experiences as well, which means that our values, our opinions, our ideas that are not just scientific are hugely integrated with the work that we do as geoscientists, even if it doesn't feel like that. And so knowing that it is impossible to separate geoscience from the kind of the values of the person that are doing it, it is then important to integrate that idea with it. And because the work that we do is so informed by the people that we are, the values that we hold, therefore the communications that we do must also be influenced and considered in the light of these same values and opinions. This can feel uncomfortable for geoscientists to do because, as I say, we're often trained into this idea that we should be objective, that we should not color the data with our own opinions, but it's impossible. It's already happened. And so the most scientific thing to do then is to add our own personal biases into the data, to consider those and see how they may have influenced it. And that then influences the way that we integrate those with communications. So because this matters so much to communications, one of the things that I was really interested in my research was the way that we kind of approach these different gaps in knowledge, the different kinds of knowledge that people have between geoscientists and non-geoscientists. So in my studies, I've looked a lot at how people from different backgrounds have different ideas about the same topic. And one of my earlier studies that I did was a study done in the southwest of England, which was asking the question about how people conceptualize the geological subsurface, how they think about it, how they picture it. And I asked this question of both geoscience professionals and non-geoscientists who just lived in these areas. And one of the things that I found that was really interesting was that there was a gap between the two groups. But the gap wasn't, as we may kind of instinctually assume, on the side of the non-geoscientists. In fact, the gap was between the geoscientists and the non-geoscientists. There was information missing on both sides. And this was really, really interesting to me because I was thinking about the issue of when you are trying to communicate about a topic in the geological subsurface, for example, like mining, which is a very persistent and important topic in the southwest of England, how do you find common ground with the people that you're trying to talk to? How do you know that you're kind of communicating the most important information? And one of the things that I found in my study was that actually the spaces where the gaps existed in different places, depending on if you were a geoscientist or a non-geoscientist. For the non-geoscientists, the gaps in understanding were not in surface issues necessarily, but in subsurface issues. So what happens as soon as you go underground? There was a lot of missing information there that didn't match what the geoscience professionals were saying about the subsurface environment. But the other interesting thing was that the way that the non-geoscientists were talking about things like culture, community, employment, and identity was also not matched by the geoscientists. So this was a really interesting kind of gap between the two, because it meant that it wasn't just the non-geoscientists that were needing to do work to fill their understanding. Both groups needed to meet in the middle. And this is really, really important because the other aspect of this that I found really fascinating was the way that the two groups experienced the kind of the geoscience subsurface. The geoscientists would often talk about the materials in the subsurface in very technical terms. What were the minerals? What were their properties? What were the rocks like physically? But the non-geoscientists were talking about experiential things like what were the colors like? What did they smell like after a rainy day? And all of these different experiences were really shaping the way that they thought and felt about the geology in their environment. And I thought this is something that geoscientists probably do as well, but just in a very different way. So it really exposed that gap between those two groups of people. And this is a gap that is best overcome by conversation, by dialogue. If you're just communicating in one direction, then you're not going to be able to understand where these gaps exist in yourself as well as in the audience that you're speaking to. But by speaking with someone, you can understand more about what they need and you can learn from that experience. So if you're feeling confident about it, if you're feeling like you have taken into account what your value systems are, you are feeling quite confident that you could communicate with someone about your subject and include your values in those, and you also are willing to engage in a dialogue and to listen to the other side as well, what do you do next? What's the next step for communicating and overcoming these barriers of fear and anger and disenchantment, unfamiliarity? Well, the most important thing to do for anyone who is actually practically starting to think about doing some communication is to think about your audience. So one of the things that I always try and do, which I do better sometimes than others, is be quite intentional about who my audience is that I'm speaking to. So hopefully throughout this talk today, I'm going to manage to keep saying geoscientists versus non-geoscientists, because what you may hear people say sometimes is, for example, a geoscientist and the public, but that excludes people without being specific about who they are. And in fact, other scientists can have difficulty understanding geoscience topics because they're not trained in our field. And so we need to be really intentional about who our audiences are, who are we speaking to. And there's lots and lots of ways that you can measure different types of audiences. So audience segmentation is a big field of study. And I quite like this diagram because it highlights some of the different ways that audiences can be divided. So based on where they live, based on their culture, their age, the way that they engage with information, their attitudes and beliefs around certain topics. There's so many different ways that you can divide an audience up. So this thing of the public, it doesn't really exist. And so we should be very careful when we're doing communications, particularly around topics that are controversial or contested, that we're being quite intentional about who our audience is, who we're speaking to and why. And so just to give this a slightly more scientific slant, this is a diagram from a study of science communication audiences in Switzerland, which is, again, there are lots and lots of these different studies around. You can look for lots of different specific topics. There's a lot of climate science ones specifically as well, if that's something that you're interested in. But I quite like this one because it breaks down science related audiences into 4 groups. So you have the science files, the ones that really love science, that probably have science as part of their identity. They think of themselves as science interested people, or maybe scientists. You then have the critically interested group who are engaged in science topics, but maybe it's something more specific than just science as a whole. You have the passive supporters, who are people that are, they'll engage with some science ideas, but they don't really consider it a part of their identity. And then you have the disengaged group, which aren't really interested in science unless it becomes critically relevant for them. And the thing that I think is really interesting here is if you think about when you're communicating about a geoscience topic, with a few exceptions, most of the time you will be communicating to that very first group in this diagram, the science files, the people that love science. I imagine everyone that is watching this talk right now identifies as a science file, someone who's into science. They think it's important to them. And the problem with that for geoscience is that actually they're not necessarily the group of people that you need to be talking to, because they already are quite good at critically assessing information, particularly science-based information. They tend to view science-based information more positively. And so they are more willing to engage with the kind of the nuances of it. Now, the group that you probably want to be engaging with are the passive supporters and the disengaged group. The disengaged group I'll get to in a second. But the passive supporters, you really have to have a reason to engage with this group. There has to be something that is drawing them to you. Sometimes this can be interest. Sometimes it can be something fun and exciting. Sometimes it can be a critical issue that has happened. And so it's important to think about with this group, again, the passive supporters is a very big audience. Even amongst like this division, 42% of kind of all people is a massive group of people. So even then, I would say that this needs to be far more specific in what audience you were trying to reach within that group: a certain age, a certain location, a certain subject. Now, the hardest group of all to reach are the disengaged, because they have no reason to engage with science ideas unless they need to. And by that point, we face multiple barriers to communications. As soon as you enter into a crisis communications, this is very, very different to normal science communication, And you need to use different strategies and different approaches because people need different information. This does make it difficult for the disengaged group because you just can't get to them. They just have no reason to talk to you before this point. But there are certainly ways that you can engage with people that are disengaged. You just need to use diverse methods of communication. So again, when we think about communications, we often think about things like this kind of presentation. So like a talk or a one-way kind of communication where someone is preparing information, they share it with others, usually visual medium, maybe through pre-recorded video. Maybe in a school is another popular way that people think about communicating through quite formal structures. But one of the things that's really important is to remember that firstly, not everyone is going to want to communicate in that way. And secondly, not everyone is going to be able to communicate in that way. Like sometimes you just don't have the time or the interest to be able to practice it enough to get good at it. And so, you know, it's one of those things where if you're communicating about a topic, you don't want to go into a school or you don't want to give a stand-up lecture, you might feel that that's it. You're not a science communicator, you can't do it. My argument would be is that actually everyone can do science communication, but not everyone should do it in the same way. There are lots of different ways to do science communication, and we should engage with all of them. Think about your own interests. How do you consume media around other topics? How do you get information about other ideas? And that's where maybe you could go to share your ideas about geoscience. These can be creative, it can be artistic, it can be fictional writing, it can be podcasting. Obviously, we're all slightly limited right now in our full range of options, but you can do informal communications wherever you go. I have quite a lot of conversations with people in train stations and airports and on call centers, and there's people who are always willing to have a conversation. So engaging in these more varied and informal methods of communication lets you reach these disengaged people because you're not really talking about science to them, you're just having a conversation. And this can be a really, really great way of getting to these people. Targeted, intentional reaching of disengaged groups is very difficult and it is expensive and it takes a lot of time and practice, but it is possible. It's just really, really hard. So say now you're feeling really good about this and you want to actually go out and do some science communication. Let's overcome these barriers. Let's get out there and share this science that we love so much. So I have a few tips that will hopefully help any of you that are interested in doing this kind of thing. And the first thing that I always like to start with is to see questions as an opportunity and not a challenge. It can feel intimidating when you are particularly in person, being asked a lot of questions by someone, especially if the questions that they're asking you don't really make sense to you. You can feel like you are not, you know, you don't have enough authority or enough knowledge to engage in this conversation. Maybe you feel like you're not an expert, so that you can't say anything. And actually, my attitude to that is that every question is an opportunity for a conversation with a caveat. I will add a caveat. But whenever I'm faced with a question from someone, particularly if it's a question that I don't necessarily know the answer to, or if I don't really know the point that they're really asking about, or but I'm in a situation where I can engage in a dialogue with them, my favorite first response to practically every question is, what do you think? Or why did you ask? Because then you get this starting point, this real nugget of intention from the person that was asking the question. You get them to explain why they want to know in the first place, and it gives you a great place to start your engagement from. The caveat to every question is an opportunity is obviously in an online environment, there are a lot of trolls and people that are just out to be provocative. This then adds to this idea that there are definitely people who feel comfortable engaging with those kind of provocative questioners. But this is why I see a question as an opportunity. It's not an opportunity you have to take every time. You should feel free to protect yourself in these environments. And if you don't feel comfortable or confident, you can literally just say, I don't know, and leave it alone, or just don't answer. Like in the online environment, there's a lot of opportunity to protect yourself if you can. We should also be using institutional structures to protect us too in these environments. So if you're engaging online and you're concerned about this kind of behavior, then I would definitely say to reach out to your institution for help and support there. There's a lot of information available to you. So the second thing that I would say is to be wary of jargon. And everyone always says this, everyone always says, watch out for jargon. But jargon is interesting because it's not just technical language. There's a couple of journal articles in my reading list that I really recommend you should check out. And also there's a lot of other information around this right now that show just how much of a barrier jargon can be to a non-expert in that field. This goes even for cases where the technical term is explained. So if you have too many technical terms that need explaining, that really presents a massive barrier to people to engaging in your topic. So you should really try and be careful of that technical language, even if you explain it. The other big one is acronyms. Acronyms are very, very bad for non-expert understanding of a science topic in particular. They're also often really unnecessary. We use a lot of acronyms that we don't need to use. EDU uses one. And so we always try and look at the cases where actually, is it better to say the European Geosciences Union than use our acronym? Because sometimes that will be the case. This doesn't count for like the popular acronyms like CO2. If it's popularly known, that's okay. But you should really be cautious of using acronyms. They are very, very bad for engagement. The other thing that comes with jargon is this idea that jargon isn't necessarily the word that you think it is. A lot of us use jargon terms that are quite basic scientifically, but actually the problem is they have multiple meanings. So just to give you a few examples of this, one of these that I use is, for example, the word model. So if I said model to you, I'm sure many of you will be thinking of a conceptual simulation. But for many people, when you say model, what they think of is this. So you're having a completely different word association, a completely different understanding of the sentence. It can also be generational. So for example, the term hotspot. For many people, this is obvious. Hotspot is obviously this kind of image you're thinking of, this kind of concept, where you're getting this kind of volcanic process through the tectonic plates. But for some people, hotspot means something very different. It will mean Wi-Fi. And so again, if you're using this term without clarifying it, then you can kind of create a misunderstanding right from the start. There's also the word sheer, which I love. I collect these kind of words, and I know a lot of different science communication researchers that do the same, and there's some really, really great lists out there that you can check out. The AGU's Sharing Science has got a fantastic one, so you should definitely go and check that out. But sheer is one of my all-time favorites because it came out of a piece of fieldwork that a friend of mine was doing where they were talking about movement along a fracture. They were talking about shear zones in a field, and the person that they were talking to was a sheep farmer. And so their association with the word shear was obviously shearing a sheep. Completely confused as to why this person was talking about shearing underground. Who would ever do that? It didn't make any sense. So it was a classic case of miscommunication, just because the word shear was so basic to the geoscientist that was doing the communicating, they didn't even think to clarify it. And then I was telling this story a while ago at a conference, and someone came up to me and said, there's another word. In fact, if you're a meteorologist, shear means something different again. It means a difference in wind speed and or direction over a short distance in the atmosphere. So these kind of words, these jargony words, they can be a big problem. So again, we're going to try another little Mentimeter. So this one, I want you to type in words, commonly used jargon that you can think of, words that you think would pop up a problem in communications. So we'll see if we can get through to it. So the code for this Mentimeter is 3755163. And you can scan the QR code if you can get it on your screen. And I want you to type in other words that might have more than one interpretation. So other jargon. So hopefully this will work. Let's see if that's going. Oh, no one said any yet. This is a bit more complicated. It's a bit less easier than voting. Oh, there we go. Got some in already. Fault is a great one. Fault is one I'm very interested in. There's a lot of associations with being wrong and being negative. Cleavage, classic. Yeah, absolutely. Fracking is an interesting one because fracking is such an industry specific term that became a public term. So you can see there are so many words that we use that are just, they have so many meanings. These are all jargon. And so if you're using these words, then you need to think about clarifying them when you're speaking to a non-geoscientist, sometimes even if you're speaking to a geoscientist, because the use of these words can be a barrier to engagement. I'm going to leave this running for a little while and I'll collect the words and then I'll send the result through to Megan at the Geological Society afterwards, and you can all have a look at the words that people said. But I'm going to just move on because we've not got very much time left. So the next point that I want to make is around diversity. And we've been hearing a lot about diversity in geoscience, especially recently, because geoscience obviously has quite a big problem with this. It is one of the least diverse sciences that exist. And it is something that we need to work hard to overcome. But it is also, it's a big problem for a lot of different reasons. And one of those reasons is communications. Because what we have found repeatedly in our studies around science communications and other types of communication as well, is that people trust people who are like themselves. So there is a yearly trust study that is called the Edelman Barometer of Trust. And they do the study every year. And so the most recent study was published in January of this year. So January of 2021 is going to be fascinating. But what it shows is the degree to which people think information that is shared by various different people in their lives is credible. And what is really interesting is that in this scale, I'm not sure how clear it is on your screens, it's quite small, so again, I can share a link later, is that the two most trusted groups in terms of credible information are experts, academic and technical experts. But the third most trusted group is a person like myself. Now, this concept has a name, and a colleague of mine that studies medical education, Catherine Wolfe, did once, she told me all about this one time, and it's called homophily. And it is the idea that you like people that are like you trust people that are like you. The issue for geoscience is if you are trying to communicate to a community, for example, and that community is full of people that are like you, then you're already overcoming a trust barrier. They're more likely to listen to what you have to say. But as we communicate to more and more diverse groups of people, we need to have a science that is represented by more and more diverse groups of people, because we need to use this connections that people have with different groups. If our subject is not representative of our society, it makes communications as just one tiny aspect of this problem even harder. And so it's really, really important to think about how we can help to change our society, how we can help our society, how we can help to change our subject, how we can help to make it even more diverse. And there are so many really great organizations out there. This is just a tiny, tiny handful of different organizations that I grabbed that you could get involved with, that you could support, that you could kind of speak with, to find out about how we can all help to improve the diversity of our subject, because it is a critically important thing to do. It's not just for communications, but from my perspective, when I'm talking about communications, diversity is just vital. It's not something that we can overcome. So I'm basically at the end now, so that I had just one more thing that I want to say. If you're thinking about communicating with people and you're worried about these barriers, is to be brave and be kind, because most people who are trying to communicate about geoscience are doing so with good intentions. I mean, we've acknowledged there are trolls out there are difficult people out there, but generally, if you treat someone who's asking you a question with kindness, and you're brave yourself in sharing your own genuine opinions and values and ideas, but protecting yourself as much as you need to, then we have a real opportunity nowadays to kind of increase the scope of these conversations that we're having, particularly with people that may never have had the opportunity to speak to geoscientists before. It brings to mind something that I saw on Twitter the other day. As a communications person, I'm on Twitter a lot, and I know its problems, but I do enjoy the platform. But it was the person saying that they'd been to the hairdresser for the first time in months, and they'd spent the whole 2 hours whilst they were there talking about the coronavirus, because it was the first time a lot of people in that environment had had the chance to speak to someone with a science background about this subject. And so just having the kind of conviction and the bravery to be able to step up and do this, it will really help to expand our ability to communicate more effectively about our science and with a much broader group of people. But yeah, all you need to do is be brave and be kind. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hazel. That was absolutely fab. I really, really enjoyed it, and I really hope that everybody watching along at home did too. I hope you're ready for a couple of questions. Hope we can have a little question and answer session now. I would encourage everybody watching along to use the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom to submit any questions that you have for Hazel, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. I hope that people will permit me to ask the first question, seeing as I get to speak to you face to face. I was thinking, as you were speaking about all of the challenges and really all of the things that you have to do to work so hard to get this right. And it seemed a little bit overwhelming. And I wonder if you have thoughts about what we have as a group of perhaps scientists or science-ophiles, as you called them, science-ophiles, what we have to gain from getting this right. What's the motivation for doing it really well?
That's a really important question, because it can be a big risk to people. It can be something that is difficult and challenging. And I think that the first thing that I would say to that as well is that it may feel, especially now, like you're alone in this, that sometimes when you're communicating, you might feel like you're doing it by yourself, and you're really, really not. The geoscience communications community is amazing and inclusive, and they are always willing to help. If anyone has questions or any ideas or anything like that, you can always run it past someone else. And actually, the value of mentoring and support in this is not something that should be overlooked. Actually, it's as well. I want to say that often the people that are doing these communications are early careers researchers or younger people, and so they can often feel like they have to do this kind of stuff without a lot of support, that they need to do it, but also they really want to. And I would say reach out and find a mentor, find someone you can ask for advice. Most people are happy to help, even now, even when everyone is going through the times. It is something that there's always someone out there to help you. But in terms of what's the benefit of getting this right, I think there are so many, and they actually are almost subject specific. I would go with the biggest one being that if we look at the big picture of this, and what do we try and achieve with geoscience communications, is that we're working to a better world. We want to make the planet a better place. We want to make it sustainable. We want green energy. We want to reduce the impacts of climate change. We want to improve the resilience of vulnerable communities around the world that experience natural hazards. There are lots of really big problems, and to solve these big problems, we need big conversations, and we need everyone to be a part of these conversations. For so long, the kind of conversations that we've had around where is our energy coming from, what kind of approaches do we take to combating climate change, how do we manage these large-scale disaster events, they've been had by very small groups of people, often in government. And now we can have these conversations with everyone, and we need to, because it's something we see all the time. If you have a community or a group of people that are not part of a conversation, you're going to overlook a problem, often not because you mean to, just because you don't know that it's there. And so the real gain that we get from seizing our courage and stepping out and having these conversations is that we get to include more people in the discussion. We get to have better conversations. We get new ideas, and hopefully we can come up with some really good solutions to these big global problems.
I think if that's not an inspiring call to action for everybody watching today, I don't know what is. I think that's great. Thanks, Hazel. So one of our first questions from the audience came from Jess, and she's asking how you might engage in a dialogue with people when you don't necessarily know a lot about that thing on a technical level.
Yeah, that's a really important question, because again, it comes back to this idea of people get asked a question, they don't want to answer it because they don't feel like an expert. And I would say that firstly, you want to think about the person that you're speaking to, because probably if you think about your experience and knowledge, you probably are an expert compared to them. But even if it's something that even if you know that, and you know that they don't know very much about it, and you know more than them, you still feel unconfident, say that. Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, well, I'm not 100% sure. I think this is where I got my information from. What do you think? And then have a conversation around it. It's also a great place to start talking about critical data. So like if you say, you know, I have this idea, but I haven't really looked at it properly, so it might be wrong. Let's go look it up together or something. There's I think owning the fact that you don't know doesn't make you less credible. For me, it makes someone more credible if they're willing to say that they don't know something. And it can make you accessible because you're not this all-knowing expert. And it also helps with imposter syndrome, because if you have imposter syndrome and you don't believe ever that you know enough to talk about this kind of stuff, then by acknowledging your limitations, you're just being honest. And I think that could be really helpful. But don't let it stop you. I mean, think about the number of people that have conversations about things that they know absolutely nothing about. Like, people do it all the time. And my classic case, you know, a few years ago was I used to use Brexit all the time because everyone had an opinion about Brexit. Everyone had a thought about it, but very few people know how it was actually ever going to work. Very few people fully understood the economics of the problem. It doesn't stop you from having an opinion as long as you're honest about where that comes from. I think that's what I would suggest.
That's great. That's harks back to your advice of being brave and being kind, and maybe try as well. Brave,
Yeah.
and give it a go.
Yeah.
So Sharon has asked us about visualizations, and if you have any advice about whether visualizations help or hinder sometimes communicating or getting your messages across.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really complicated question. I'm so glad you asked, though. It was something I was considering including, but then I have so much to say about so many things. But anyway, the issue with visualizations, particularly static images, is the way that people interpret them is very specific to each circumstance. It's very subjective. One of the biggest most useful studies that I found recently was one that I've added to the reading list, which is about the way that people interpret scale in diagrams. Now, this is a really big problem, and we've seen a lot of it around the conversation with fracking, where the scale of fracking infrastructure is misrepresented, which leads to people feeling more afraid or more concerned or more angry about what is being proposed. The problem with this is that adding a numerical scale to a diagram that has an incorrect proportional scale doesn't fix the problem. People still see the proportional scale, and that's what they read. So you have to be really, really careful with scale in particular, that you're representing that proportionally. This makes some diagrams incredibly difficult to make, but there's ways around it. But I would say that in general, the most effective communications combine written and visual, or verbal and visual. It gives people more options into an idea, but you have to make sure that they're saying the same thing, and then think about the way that they're being interpreted.
Okay, awesome. We've got a question here which relates a little bit to your some of the big geoscience concepts here, from scale to risk. Kevin has asked what tips you have when you're considering the communication of risk, and thinking specifically to contaminated land, but also to some other technical things such as mining or even hydrocarbons, which you touched on earlier.
Yeah, and again, I would say that risk is its own field of, so risk communication is its own field of study, I would say. Risk is very complicated to communicate. I think the problem that we most come up against, that is in my experience, is that scientists, they assess risk based on the kind of the numbers of it. It's called actuarial risk. It's like, what is the statistical likelihood of this happening? And then my understanding of the statistics allows me to process the risk in a certain way. What you, as the communicator of a risk kind of scenario, need to appreciate is that most people don't process risk in this way. They don't process it by assessing the statistics. It's proportional and it's subjective. And so this is why we often use the example with risk communications, in that people are completely comfortable taking a car, riding in a car, driving a car, but they often are more nervous about flying in an airplane. Now, statistically, flying in an airplane is much safer than driving a car, but driving a car is more familiar. So people, they adjust the risk according to their familiarity. So I would say that when you're talking about a risk, contaminated land is, again, it's tricky because it's kind of familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Often these are in a city or urban environment, so people might feel that they know the place and they know what's happened with it. And so you're adding a layer of unfamiliarity to a familiar place. This means that it needs to be handled really carefully, but I would say that in this circumstance, the best place to kind of approach these concepts is through quite an in-depth dialogue with the target communities. Again, it takes a long time, it can be expensive, but what you want to think about is you want to learn what these communities already think about their environment, and then you can add the information in there, understanding their familiarity and how they're proportionally assessing the risk themselves, and then you can meld the two together. But it is really complicated, so I don't envy you that one.
The right way to do it is not always, I guess, the easiest way either.
Nope, or the quickest or the cheapest, unfortunately.
So we have a question from Peter, and he's asking about audiences. And it's about, so he says, it's obviously not possible to only talk to one type of audience at a time, because sometimes you don't get to choose. So in that instance, would you recommend communicating with a wide scope to try and catch everybody, or by multiple strands of different communications for different audiences?
Yeah, that is a really good point, especially if we're talking about kind of automated or remote communications, where you may be, like, say, doing some kind of information campaign. You can't target so well. But what you can, I would say, to do is to do multiple strains of communication, making sure that they're all kind of saying the same thing. You want to keep your messaging consistent, but you want to use different approaches to those messages. And if you can, you want to, again, think about who is your main audience, who are you speaking to? Because you'll always, with any kind of publicly facing communication, you're always going to catch people that are not your audience, but they're almost not as important as the people that you're trying to speak to. So I would say it's still okay to intentionally design a big, massive publicly facing campaign with an intentional audience in mind, because they're the ones that you really want to engage. And anyone else that you get is great, and you can add separate threads for them if you need to, if you need multiple audiences. But I would say you still want to be quite intentional with who you're writing something for. Otherwise, it can just come across as confused. So yeah, multiple threads, but still with each one having its own audience would be what I would say. Again, not cheap.
That's great. So we have time for one quick last question. Thank you so much, Hazel, for this incredibly insightful talk and for taking the time to answer everybody's questions, which are just filling up in the chat. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get through all of them. But this one is from Kieran, and Kieran's asking if you think that the portrayal of geologists in the media, and cites an example of the Big Bang Theory, it's not a real science, affects the public's confidence in our opinions and expertise, and therefore our ability to communicate as a group.
Yeah, I think this is Yeah, I think this is a problem. I mean, I was quite surprised the other day to see one of the vintage ones rear its head again, which was Ross from Friends. And I'm like, good grief, I haven't seen a Ross from Friends reference in years. But yeah, we do suffer, I think. And I mean, I have problems with the Big Bang Theory beyond just the geology representation. But yeah, I think this happens with geoscience movies. I don't know, I'm sure many of you saw the absolute beautiful catastrophe that was the recent geoengineering film. That was just dreadful. It was dreadful. And they often are. I think science suffers from this as a whole. I don't think that geoscience is unique in this. I think that all science subjects suffer from misrepresentation and stereotyping. But again, this is something that we as individual communicators can combat, because it's kind of hard to stereotype someone when you know someone that is that person. And I would say that if yeah, we do suffer. I think all science subjects suffer from misrepresentation through the media, particularly the popular media. But yeah, I would say as an individual going out and talking to people and being a real live geologist or a real live geoscientist or a researcher or whatever, you're helping to combat those stereotypes. So the more that you can do it, the better it is for everyone. And maybe more geologists should make movies. I don't know, maybe that's what it is.
There you go. More conversations, more movies, more geologists out there doing it. So that's brilliant, Hazel. Thanks so much. We're really appreciative and very honoured that you gave this public lecture for us. And thanks to everybody else for coming and attending and watching, to everybody who attended through Eventbrite, joined the Zoom, and who's watched live on YouTube. We'll share the resources on our webpage that Hazel sort of mentioned earlier in her talk, and we hope to see you at some of the rest of our Earth Science Week events, and again at our next public lecture. Take care, everybody, and goodbye.